morning, everyone. Like you said, my name is Alex Cadel. I am the Climate Services Specialist for Nova Scotia. I work in a shared role, actually, between an organization called CLIMAtlantic, as well as Nova Scotia's Department of Environment and Climate Change. And I really just appreciate everyone taking some time here this morning. I know it's a busy time of year for many to do a bit of a deeper dive into a climate change topic. For those of you that aren't aware of CLIMAtlantic, we are still relatively new as an organization. So just to highlight what we are and what we do, we're the Climate Services Hub for Atlantic Canada. So we provide support for all types of organizations and individuals that are doing work related to climate change adaptation. So for example, I do a lot of work assisting people with accessing and understanding climate change information, connecting people with resources and expertise, developing tools, delivering training, very much like this, communications and engagement work, a lot of things in that realm. If any of that sounds interesting beyond what I'm talking about today, or if you'd like to learn more, feel free to check out our website, which is climatlantic.ca, CLIMatlantic.ca. You can find my contact information and a whole lot more about what we do there if you want to have any other conversations about climate change and adaptation in our region. But for what we're here to talk about today, we're doing a deep dive into growing degree day analysis for wild blueberry in Nova Scotia. I think this is a really interesting and hopefully timely topic as well. I know I've seen a lot of growing awareness from different folks that our weather conditions and our seasons are already somewhat different from what they used to be. And today we're having an opportunity to do a bit of a deeper dive into one aspect of that being growing degree days. So just as a highlight of sort of how we've structured today, I'm aiming to talk for 30, 40 minutes or so. I'll turn things back over to Hugh, who has a few things he'd like to say as well. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for any questions. So just as a quick background here, what is this work and why was it done? Really just wanting to highlight this was a very informal collaborative project between staff at a few different organizations. Myself with CLIMAtlantic, Hugh at Perennia, and Julie Bailey at the Department of Agriculture, who first made the connection that we should all sit down and have a conversation. So thanks, Julie, for that. As I think it really did, as we were chatting that initial time, lead to some interesting questions that we wanted to try and tackle if we could. Being that, can we analyze growing degree day trends using climate change data, using the model that you mentioned, and I'll show in just a moment here, and some of the climate data that I'm used to working with. And if we're able to do that, how could that information be helpful for guiding adaptation within the wild blueberry sector in Nova Scotia? So really just mentioning that because this has been a project that we've all just sort of been working on the side of our desks when we could squeeze it in between other work. So if any of the information today sounds interesting, I think there's a really good foundation here that we could build on further, maybe a great student project down the line or something like that. So it's been sort of just our baby today, and we're excited to share it with others and just talk about what we've been doing for the last few months. So let's talk first about this wild blueberry growing degree day model that sort of enabled all of this work to happen. And maybe before we even get into that, let's first make sure that we're all on the same page about what a growing degree day is. This is a measure that is used to estimate the growth and development of plants and insects based on the concept that development of these organisms will only occur if the temperature exceeds some minimum base temperature. And that does differ by the organism as well. For wild blueberry in Nova Scotia, we use 0 degrees Celsius. So growing degree days are a measure of the accumulated heat available during the growing season. So they're calculated for the growing season. For Nova Scotia, we use the period from April 1st through October 31st. And basically we compare the mean daily temperature to that base temperature that I mentioned, 0 degrees, and we accumulate the difference per calendar day. So just as an example, I took a look at the forecast for the next few days. This might have changed, but for example, on April 1st, I had a forecast mean temperature for where I am in Dartmouth of 6 degrees, April 2nd, 0 degrees, April 3rd, 2 degrees. So for growing degree day calculations, we would, on April 1st, accumulate that 6 degrees Celsius. On April 2nd, we don't add anything to it, stays at 6. April 3rd, we add that 2 degrees to it, becomes 8, and just keep that running total over the course of the entire growing season. So if it helps for context, somewhere around 2,700 growing degree days is typical for the areas that we're talking about today over the course of that whole growing season. So let's talk about this model itself that, like I mentioned, enabled all of this work to happen. This was originally published by White and colleagues back in 2012, and through conversations with you, wanted to mention as well that it's still being worked on. So for example, the growing degree day thresholds were just updated last year based on some new research data, some further improvements planned as well. I know you mentioned hoping to incorporate the fruit bud F2 stage in the next year or so, maybe eventually fruit ripening or things like that as well. So this model is a great starting point, but it may even be more useful in the future as well. And what it specifically does is it's looking at a variety of different growth and development milestones, I suppose, for a wild blueberry crop in Nova Scotia, organized into plant emergence, tip dieback, and stems with open flowers, with some various percentages associated with those. And what it does is identifies the growing degree day threshold where those milestones are expected to be met. So for example, looking at a non-bearing or sprout year, plant emergence is anticipated to start by around 270 degree days, 10% plant emergence by 290 degree days, and so on. So when we sat down and I saw this model, I was really excited about this because in my work, we often talk about climate change impacting plant growth and development in a relatively general way. But I think this provides a really very specific model that we could use to do a deep dive into identifying how these growing degree day thresholds are changing and what that means for the timing of blueberry crop growth and development. So that's what we're here to talk about today. There we go. So what is the approach that we took in order to do this? First of all, we're trying to identify or determine the date when each of these growing degree day thresholds for all of those 15 milestones mentioned in the model there were met, and looking over time to determine if that date is changing. So really two components to this, one looking backwards towards the past to identify have there been any changes to date in growing degree day thresholds. To do this, we analyzed daily historical data for 3 weather stations that are located in 3 key blueberry production regions in the province to understand that historical variability and trends in growing degree days. And the next piece of this was looking forward towards the future, bringing in some climate model data to understand what changes we might anticipate in the years to come. To do this, we analyzed daily time series data from downscale climate models for those same 3 regions to project future trends, and ultimately hoping that this information is helpful for Perennia and the Department of Agriculture for supporting the wild blueberry industry and adapting to climate change. That's all I'll say about methodology for today. I know the interest is often more on the results and what they mean, and that's what we'll focus on for the rest of our time here today. But I did just want to mention for anyone out there that is more interested in the research side of this, a lot of the work here was involved in figuring out the methodology, developing the spreadsheet tools to automate a lot of this analysis. And really, it's gotten to a point where it's quite easy to replicate this approach to look at any other degree day thresholds in other regions and things like that. So if there is interest in taking this further, I'd be very happy to answer questions about methodology or share any resources that may be helpful. But otherwise, we'll leave that piece aside for today. So before we get into the results here, I did want to just spend a little bit of time on climate and weather. I know this is probably not new for anyone here, but it is just a key principle to understand the results I'll be talking about, because as you mentioned, I don't have a crystal ball exactly. I'm not predicting exactly what will happen in future years. That's just sort of beyond our ability to do. But I can show what a typical year in the future might look like over time. So I just want to make that very clear with a quick analogy here, one that's stuck with me about thinking about the difference between climate and weather. And that's thinking about a person walking a dog. I don't know if you've ever walked a dog or ever seen a dog being walked, but if it's anything like mine, it certainly isn't walking anywhere in a nice straight line. It's often darting back and forth across the path, sniffing at whatever it can find. It probably looks quite chaotic. The point where if I asked you to predict where exactly that dog was going to be in a future period of time, that would be really difficult to do. But what we can do is look at the person walking that dog who is probably taking a much straighter path. And if we are able to, it's difficult to estimate where the dog, the weather, would be in the future. But if we analyze the trend, the person walking, or the climate, we can better understand the area where that future weather is likely to be in. So hopefully that helps to contextualize a little bit. So when I'm referring to dates here and there, it's really just talking about that long-term trend. It's not exactly what will happen, but it's helping to bound what will happen. So I know for producers, weather is often the primary concern here. You're interested in the timing of frost events, drought, large storms, things like that. And those weather conditions have always varied from year to year. They will continue to do so, much as they have historically. But looking at this climate trend here helps us to understand what an average year in the future might look like and how the weather might vary around that average. So that's what we're focusing on today. So let's get into the first part here, the historical data. Talk through the historical piece first, and then move into the climate projections after that. So for the historical data, like I mentioned, we selected 3 weather stations that are located in blueberry production regions in the province. So one in Parsboro, one in Truro and Deberts, and one in Collegeville that was intended to be representative of Guysborough. We know there are other locations in the province as well. Sorry, I don't know if that's showing up. There we go. No, there are other locations in the province as well, but this was an attempt to at least capture some of the spatial variation in what's happening around the province. The other reason why we picked these 3 stations specifically is that they had relatively long data records to help us understand the story of what has happened to date. We wanted to know what a typical year used to look like, and has that already changed? And these were stations that allowed us to do that. So specifically here, again, downloaded daily weather data from each of those stations, calculated the cumulative growing degree days for each day of the growing season, identified what date each of those 15 growing degree day thresholds from the model were met for each year over the entire data record. And that's what I'll be showing just coming up here. Just wanted to mention one more thing before we start. There's a number of slides here where I just have the results for Truro. That's just because it had the longest data record. It's relatively central, and I'm just trying to keep the number of charts and data down. There are a few places where I will still show the spatial comparison between all 3 stations, but if you're wondering why I'm talking about Truro so much, that's just why. It's just for reducing complexity. So looking at the historical data, what did we see? First, maybe I'll just describe the chart that's being shown on the right here. On the, in case this is too small to see, on the horizontal axis is each individual year from 1873 through 2021, because yes, there's weather station data in Truro going back to 1873, which was great. On the vertical axis is showing the day of the year. We might call the Julian date. So for example, January 1st is day 1, January 2nd is day 2, and so on. And just on the chart here, I just picked 3 of those 15 milestone trends to show. Just again, for simplicity, I didn't want to throw too much information here. All the trends are relatively similar. I just picked a few that were somewhat spaced out here. If you see any areas with gaps in the chart here, there are occasional years that had insufficient data. I just used a threshold if it needed to have at least 95% of the data for the growing season to include here, and to just eliminate some of those outliers that could have otherwise swayed the data here. So just again, for an example here, the green line at the bottom here is showing 10% plant emergence, which typically occurs somewhere around day 142. Just for context, May 22nd is day 142, if that helps. So what do we see if we look at these patterns over that entire historical data record? First, not surprising, but we see very clearly that weather patterns vary from year to year. That's not surprising. Like I mentioned, we know that some years are hotter or colder than others based on some regional climate factors, but this is a really good way to visualize that. It's not a nice straight line of data here, though I have indicated that with the black dotted line for each of these is the average. It's a lot of peaks and valleys in there. But what we can see if we put the overlay this on the line of the average there is that we can quantify that interannual variability. So looking at each of these thresholds, we notice that for most years, for those statistically minded out there, I'm talking about those within 1 standard deviation, but most years meet the growing degree day thresholds within plus or minus 5 days of the average. And nearly all years, so the difference between the maximum and the minimum, are within 10 days of the long-term average. And the other thing that we see here is that there hasn't been any change in that range over time. The same difference between the maximum and the mean in 1873 seems to be what it is currently today as well. So no change in range, which was useful to note. One change that we can see here is that the average dates that these growing degree day milestones are being met are occurring slightly earlier in more recent years than they were historically. It's not by much. These aren't very steep lines. It's just a very gentle slope, maybe like 1 to 3 days earlier in the year than they have been, than these thresholds have been met historically. So just putting that in the table here and summarizing this by 30-year periods rather than just for each individual year to show what this looks like in a tabular format here. And again, the numbers that you're seeing in the table here are the Julian date or the day of the year. For the first row there, I have filled in actual month and day, if that really helps to contextualize this. So plant emergence start day 140, that's May 20th. Tip dieback 90%, day 218, that's August 6th. So hopefully that's useful. I just didn't want to crowd the chart too much with dates. So what we can see here is that looking at the whole 150-year data record and taking these 30-year averages, you can see that on average, the date for hitting each of these 15 growing degree day thresholds was quite consistent, kind of within a day or two, until potentially the most recent 30-year period here. In 1990 through 2020, we can see that I think for just about every growing degree day threshold here, that's the earliest it had ever been met in the record on average. And most of those are kind of 1 to 3 days earlier than they had been met historically as well. So useful to note that that's probably the climate change signal starting to pop into our data record. I know anecdotally, folks have been identifying that things are warmer than they used to be, and this is sort of the weather station data backing that up. Again, this table is just for Truro here because it had the longest data record, but just to mention as well for both Parsboro and that Collegeville station, we do see earlier dates in the 1990 through 2020 period compared to the 1960 through 1990. Potentially a clearer trend here is in relation to the total growing degree days. So that's the total heat accumulated by the end of the growing season, that October 31st date. And it's a little bit clearer, just it's a larger number. It's easier to see a longer term trend here. So it's more obvious that total growing degree days is on an upward trajectory as the climate warms. We've seen an increase from kind of fewer than 2,600 total growing degree days in the late 1800s to closer to 2,700 in more recent decades as well. And again, just a quick spatial comparison here between those three locations. The chart on the left is just showing one of those growing degree day thresholds, stems with open flowers 50%, and on the right is showing total growing degree days. And really the point I wanted to make here is that all three of these locations follow similar year-to-year patterns. They're having their peaks and valleys at the same times, showing that the main driver for when growing degree day thresholds are being met are regional weather patterns rather than any other differences between these locations specifically. So useful to recognize that while there are some minor differences between each location, they tend to follow similar trends. So let's skip the slide there. There we go. So just to further explain or explore those spatial differences, again, this is just based on that most recent 30-year period, 1990 through 2020. This is showing the data for each of those three weather stations. We can see that on average, the Collegeville weather station reached these thresholds a little bit earlier than Truro, which was itself a little bit earlier than Parsboro. It's not a major difference here. On average, all three locations met their growing degree day thresholds within a few days of each other. Again, they're at similar latitudes, so not surprising, but that's useful to note. And again, certainly remember that these results may or may not be representative of where exactly you're located, depending on how similar your location is to the location and the elevation of the weather station. But hopefully this is at least relatively representative of the trends across the region. So just wrapping that up with some key messages from the historical trends that we looked at here, we can see that to date, the growing degree day thresholds were on average met on approximately the same dates historically. That's only really started to change in recent years where we're starting to see these dates being met, these dates move up rather by 1 to 3 days on average. Second thing we noted here was that the exact dates do certainly vary year to year, like we saw, lots of peaks and valleys, but most of the growing degree day thresholds are met within 5 days of the average with no change in range over time. So that's useful to note because the year-to-year variability is greater than the climate change trend to date. We talked about those 5 days compared to 1 to 3 days with climate change. That signal is really small based on sort of the typical variability that we're already used to, again, to date. So remember that going forward. The other trend that we saw is that total growing degree days for the growing season have increased. That's probably the most notable trend. And that while there are some slight differences between the three geographic regions, all three show similar trends over time. So that wraps up the historical piece. We'll put that aside for now. And like I said, turn an eye towards the future, get into some of the climate model data. And just to contextualize what we're looking at here, I'm not going to do a full climate change 101, but did want to mention a few words around just the modeling and scenarios that we're using here. Because when we try and understand what the future might look like, obviously that's difficult to do. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do have models. And what we use there is complex climate models, massive series of equations that help us to understand the long-term patterns and averages of our climate system. Obviously, when we're trying to understand what the future looks like, that's still dependent on choices that we're making today. So one of the ways that we try and understand that uncertainty is by using climate change scenarios that represent different plausible futures. So today I'm going to make reference to a couple of those scenarios. One which is represented in red on the chart here, which we call SSP5 8.5. That's our high emissions future. And the second one on the chart represented in green is our low emissions future we call SSP2 4.5. Even if you've heard me talk about climate change before and some of these terms feel unfamiliar, that's because I'm using the latest report from the IPCC, the AR6 Sixth Assessment Report data. That only very recently became available for downscale data across Canada. So this was really the first chance to use that in a good way. So you're really getting the latest and greatest here to, I guess, drive that point home. A few points about the scenarios themselves that are useful to understand is, first of all, we can see that even under a very optimistic low emissions future, the average conditions that we can expect in the future are significantly warmer than they were in the past, which is denoted by that envelope in gray there. And the second, regardless of what we do, there are changes coming and we should prepare for them. And the other point I wanted to make here is just related to the difference between scenarios. So we can see that towards the end of the century, there certainly are some differences there. But for the next several decades, sort of until mid-century or so, we can see that the scenarios are actually quite aligned. They overlap a lot more than they don't, which means that until 2050, 2060 or so, we actually have quite a good bounded understanding of the path that our climate is trending towards and can start to make some decisions for the near term based on that. Now, I guess just a quick note here on the time periods, the time horizons that I'm talking about over the next few slides here. Again, I know for producers and those that are supporting them, that current or near-term time frame is going to be most of interest. That's what's influencing your decisions, and we'll certainly focus on that where we can. But wanted to just mention that that mid-century timeframe may already be relevant for some of the policy, program, infrastructure development pieces and conversations that are ongoing that have a much longer lead time. And that end of century timeframe, while we may not necessarily be making decisions around that in this industry at this time, I think it is still valuable for education at the very least. We can start to understand or ask questions like, what could being a wild blueberry grower in Nova Scotia look like by the end of the century? So we'll make reference to all three of those time periods as we go here: the near term, the midterm, and the long term, and what the outlook is for each of those. So for the actual projections and data that we used here, again, we downloaded daily climate model data from the National Climate Data Portal, climatedata.ca. This is the latest CMIP6 projections. I used an ensemble of 7 models. There are more available, but 7 was at least enough to make sure that we're trying to get some understanding of the variability between how different groups represent climate data. And these models have been downscaled across Canada to approximately 7 by 10 kilometer grid cells. And I've selected the 3 grid cells here that aligned with the weather station locations that we mentioned earlier. And of course, the climate model runs themselves don't just start in the present day, they start in the past to initialize. So it means we have modeled data for the years from 1950 through to 2100. So since we had modeled data for historical and actual weather station data for historical, the first thing I wanted to do was just compare those two, which is what you're seeing here. How closely do these two data sets align, the weather station data and the modeled data? So again, just looking at one time period here, 1980 through 2010, the recent past, showing the when these growing degree day thresholds were met based on the climate model data, based on the weather station data, and the third row there is showing the difference. So a quick look here just shows that the climate model data does match the historical weather station data quite well. There are some slight differences off by a day or so here and there, but remember the model ensemble is only replicating plausible history, not exactly what happened, and even our historical data certainly isn't perfect. There's measurement errors and data gaps. So taking that all into account, I'm pretty confident that the model ensemble here is effectively reproducing the average conditions that we're seeing on the ground. It's not a detailed statistical analysis, but I think it at least passes the eye test quite well. So what did we see looking at all this? I think this and the next one are probably the most interesting slides that I'm showing here today. So I'm just going to spend a minute or so talking about them here. Again, the chart on the right here is showing when these growing degree day thresholds are met. You can see all 15 of them on the chart there. The chart itself, the lines are depicting the 30-year running averages on a decadal basis for each of those 15 growing degree day thresholds, which is why we have the nice smooth lines there. So remember, back to weather and climate, when we're talking about what's actually happening on the ground, we can still expect that plus or minus 5 days for most years around each of these, but this is showing where the average is moving. And what we can see here is that there's some very strong trend towards earlier growth and development in blueberry compared to the period that we're used to. So thinking again, or comparing to that recent past, 1981 through 2010, if you look ahead to the period that we're currently in, 2010 through 2040, we can expect that on average, all of these growing degree day milestones are being met about 1 week earlier than they were historically. Looking a little bit further ahead to that mid-century time frame, all of those growing degree day milestones are met around 2 weeks earlier than they were historically. And long-term future, towards the end of the century, all of those growing degree day thresholds being met around 3 weeks earlier than they were historically. So I think that's pretty notable, even considering that interannual variability that I mentioned, that plus or minus 5 days. We can anticipate that the years that had the earliest blueberry growth and development historically may be the years with the latest development for those same milestones that we see in the coming decades. Maybe I should have thrown something on the chart here, but if you can see my mouse at all, you can see that for tip dieback, 90% used to average around 215 days or so. So a very early date for tip dieback might have been, plus 5 or minus 5 days, around 210 days or so. And if we follow that over to mid-century, around 2050 or so, we can see that 210 days, what would be very early for tip dieback, would actually be kind of the latest that we would anticipate with that range. Notably, all of this is still considering April 1st as the date for the start of the growing season. So potential issue there, and we did look into that a little bit. At some point in the future, we may need to start considering March 1st rather than April 1st as the start of the growing season for Nova Scotia. Did rerun some of the calculations for that, and that would even move some of these milestones a couple of days earlier than they are showing here, but useful just to point that out as well. So combining some of this into those time periods that I mentioned as well, and just wanted to put this in tabular format for if that makes more sense, and just mention a few of these specifically with some dates attached in hopes that that might provide a little bit more context here. So I selected a few of these. Again, just plant emergence, 10% is the first one here. Historically, around day 140 or May 20th might be what we would have expected for 10% plant emergence. Already, and in the years to come, we can anticipate May 14th being more typical for 10% plant emergence. By mid-century, May 8th for 10% plant emergence, and by the end of the century, May 3rd would be more typical. Stems with open flowers, 50%. Again, historically, June 4th might be the date that we would anticipate that occurring. Already, and in the years to come, May 29th would be what we'd expect. By mid-century, May 23rd. By the end of the century, May 17th for stems with 50% open flowers. And finally, tip dieback, 90%. Historically, August 1st, day 213 would be where we would expect that to happen on average. Already, July 24th might be more typical. By mid-century, July 15th. By the end of the century, July 7th would be when we could expect that 90% tip dieback. Again, on average, plus or minus 5 days, depending on the exact weather for the year. So hopefully that alone is some potentially useful information for the industry to help prepare for the immediate changes for the period that we're already in, being aware of some of those mid-century changes that we know are coming. And while there is certainly a bit of an opportunity to avoid those end-of-century changes, if we do see some relatively immediate and drastic reductions in global emissions, for now, this represents what we could be on track for and helps with that education piece that I mentioned. Again, looking at total growing degree days for the growing season, very clear trend here. You remember that historically around 2,600 to 2,700 growing degree days was sort of what we expected in our historical period. Already around 3,000 might be more typical for what we're starting to see. By mid-century, getting closer to 3,400, 3,500 growing degree days for these locations, and upwards of 3,800 by the end of the century. And taking the change in growing degree day thresholds as well as the total growing degree days into account, I just want to highlight very quickly some of the potential opportunities and risks associated with these changes. First of all, could have the opportunity of faster rate of crop development, as if blueberries are able to take advantage of this excessive heat and mature more quickly, for example. There's an opportunity, I guess, within the wider agricultural sector to produce more food or grow different types of crops, different varieties that we haven't been able to sustain in our region because the temperatures have been too cold, for example. But certainly some risks to be aware of as well here. Potentially with the higher heat that I was talking about, leading to more evaporation, potential for increased water stress could certainly be something that we're facing in the future. These higher heat conditions can sometimes be more favorable for pests and diseases and invasive species than they are for some of our native vegetation. So something to be aware of and potentially manage for as well. And certainly even things like pollination timing, when we're looking at the stems with open flowers. Are pollinators available at the times that we need them to? Are there any changes into how we have agreements set up to enable that to happen? And all of those different considerations start to come to the surface when we look at how the climate is changing and how that influences crop development. So just last few slides here. I know that frost dates are something of interest, so I just thought I'd share a little bit on that front as well. The graphs from the next few slides are from, again, the National Climate Data Portal, climatedata.ca, showing changes in frost dates, and I'm really just highlighting the median dates here. So again, looking historically for the last frost that we typically got in spring for Truro, that was around May 20th, more recently around May 16th would be the average date of our last spring frost. Already somewhere around May 7th might be more typical. By mid-century, April 26th might be our last spring frost. End of the century, April 11th. So, and those are all under that high emission scenario. So last spring frost could be 39 days earlier by the end of the century than it was historically. Even under that low emission scenario, last spring frost could be 25 days earlier than it was historically. And exact same thing showing for the first fall frost, again for Truro, again for both scenarios, showing that our first frost in fall in Truro historically was around September 28th, more recently around October 3rd. Already around October 18th might be a more typical average date for the first frost that we see in fall. By mid-century, October 29th might be more typical, and by the end of the century, November 13th. So under that high emission scenario, our first frost in fall could be 46 days later than it was historically. And even under that optimistic low emission scenario could be 32 days later than it was historically. So just putting both of those things together, this is showing the increase in the length of our frost-free season, which is just adding up both of those numbers. So just to highlight here the overall changes under that high emission scenario, we could see a frost-free season that is 85 days longer in Truro, and under a low emission scenario, even under a low emission scenario, 57 days longer than it was historically. So that was probably a lot of information to absorb. Maybe I was a bit ambitious in what I wanted to cover today, but hopefully that was useful. Let's just wrap up with a few key messages on what came out of these future trends that I was talking about. So first of all, the growing degree days for wild blueberry are expected to be met on average earlier than they have been historically. So in the near term, we're expecting that's approximately 1 week earlier on average. In the midterm, around 2 weeks earlier on average, and in the long term, around 3 weeks earlier on average. And I didn't show a ton of regional comparisons here, but similar magnitude of change across all 3 stations that we looked at, Parsboro, Truro, and Guysborough. We can anticipate that total growing degree days are anticipated to increase relatively substantially. I showed that graph, and that our frost-free season is also projected to increase quite substantially. It's important to understand these changes because they might bring new opportunities and new risks for wild blueberry growers in Nova Scotia. And I know Hugh's going to talk momentarily about some of the work that's underway at Perennia to support people with monitoring and understanding these changes. And really, I guess the message to leave my part on here is that understanding and planning for these changes will help the growers and the industry to prepare and adapt for the changing climate. And hopefully today is a first step for building that understanding, and we can continue to work together going forward on what exactly that looks like. But Hugh, I'll turn it back over to you here now and stop sharing my screen, and we can continue on.
Wow, that's great. That's what I call an expert talk, and I call it crystal ball, and you call it models. That's the professional term. Okay, well, great models and great presentation, Alex. Thank you so much, and for using wild blueberry as an example to start this work. We do have some questions in the chat, but I do like to go over a quick few slides before we answer questions. And Alex, you can take a look first, and I'm going to share my screen quickly here. Just a couple of things I want to say before I see that. Are you able to see my screen, Alex? Okay, so I just want to give you a quick update on the wild blueberry blog, because that will contain of the weather and then GDD updates, which I think some of the updates are complete, but I'm still working a couple of things. So if you come to the wild blueberry blog, now you can see the Nova Scotia wild blueberry weather station sites. I don't know if you guys seeing the full map yet, but here is what I have here. You can see all 55 stations just on wild blueberry fields. And I know some of you have other crops or other regions you want to check. feel free to come to this calibrated Mesonet network to search other stations. In this map, only wild blueberry field stations, 55 in total. The second part you can see here, we also show the wild blueberry field soil temperature. So this map, those kind of like the first one, but we only have 43 weather stations out of 55 had the soil temperature probes. So what you can see here, once you click on the any station, go to the live data link, and you'll be able to see the station's current condition, including the soil temperature, which I think is pretty important for the spring herbicide application, as well as the fall herbicide application. So let me go back to this map. All right, so if you keep scrolling down, I list all the weather stations by county, so you can see each county's weather station. There's some work I'm still trying to finish before April 1st, but most of them are quite ready to go. So feel free to come to the weather page to search information you need for blueberry growers and any researchers, or if you are working anything related to wild blueberry industry. The second thing I want to show you is the GDD and phenology tracker. We will continue this service this year. How this table needs to be updated. I'm still doing some of the editing here. We are still going to provide a service of reporting wild blueberry stations GDDs, but we are not going to do all 55 stations reporting. We are going to pick stations based on the research needs and some of the logistical thinkings we have here. So we are probably going to be only reporting about 20 stations, and I will make a list once we select those stations. For growers who want to track or calculate their own GDDs for their station, or any stations that you can get the data, there's an Excel sheet that you can download from wild blueberry page and the Perennial website that you can just simply enter each day's max and minimum temperature, and that will calculate the GDDs for you automatically. I'm going to introduce an online tool that we are working on, just a screenshot because it's not fully launched yet, but I will show you in a second. We are also going to provide service of providing the percentage of F2 this year. You can see all locations I went to last couple of seasons, and I'll continue adding those points here, and you can see the most updated percentage of F2 from those locations once we get into the monolinear or pre-monolinear season. Okay, as I said, I just want to show a quick slide here, sorry. Yeah, something like that. I'm not too confident to share the website yet because we are still working on it, but something similar to this, if you click one of the station and you enter the base temperature for wild blueberry or for any other models you are using, and then just click on the, put in your start day and then put in your the end day, that'll calculate the GDDs for you. Here I use example from January 1st until today, and that gives us about 50 degree days from last 3 months, but like we are looking into April 1st as our start date, but that does show us the January has some of the warm days for about 0 degree days here. Okay, so we continue to do research and update those GDDs. So each year we will give you the most important crop stages and their GDDs. So this is the most updated GDDs I want you guys to pay attention to. I will bring some of the hard copies to the meeting tomorrow. So this graph is also available under the wild blueberry page. So always search the most updated GDD. So the first one, like plant emergency, last year we used 270. This year we are aiming for early plant emergency, and we will see the new research data and new observation coming in if we need to adjust this. So those are the new dates, and the new things we have added here is the percentage of F2. So 40% F2, 170 GDD. That's the number you want to pay attention to once you're getting into the monolinear season. Okay, just want to quickly update. I know I show this multiple times to the industry. We are continuing working on research to improve our accuracy and also some of the new stages we want to study. So we'll continue to work on the planned emergency GDDs, and I know Scott is going to take care of this part. For Puenia and for myself and the association, we will continue to work on to validate the percentage of F2 this year, and I'm going to go choose more sites this year. The second thing we want to do is to validate this percentage of bloom numbers here, and that would help us to determine the beehive placement and also the botrytis blight season. The third one you can expect from us is we are going to work on develop GDDs for the first blue and up to about 50% ripening. So the first blue is really an important stage. You can help you to determine and then to make a decision when you should put those insect traps out to monitor for your SWD or blueberry maggots, and also helping to plan with harvesting as well. Other than that, so you can expect me or other people will update those information at the AGM or in the winter meetings next year. So you is probably going to see us a lot running in the fields to counting blueberry stems. Other than that, that's my last slide.